Okay, now let's look at the 14 facial bones. These are the bones that have no direct contact with the brain or the meninges, the coverings of the brain. The facial bones support the teeth. They give shape and individuality to the face. They form part of the orbital and nasal cavities and provide attachments for muscles of facial expression and mastication, that's chewing. There are 2 maxilla, 2 palatine bones, 2 zygomatic bones, 2 lacrimal bones, 2 nasal bones, 2 inferior nasal conchae, 1 vomer, and 1 mandible. And naturally, each of them have features that we'll take a look into now. Let's look first at the maxillary bones. The maxillary bones are the largest of the facial bones. They're located here, right on either side of the nose, and they form the upper jaw. They meet each other at the intermaxillary suture right here. They have alveolar processes that dip down between each of the teeth. The alveolus is the socket that actually holds the teeth. We'll see that the maxilla also forms the inferior-medial wall of the orbit, or the eye socket, here. It has in it an intraorbital foramen and an infraorbital fissure. Infra meaning below the orbit, foramen meaning hole. And here we can see the inferior orbital fissure. The maxilla forms most of the hard palate you can see here. Behind the maxillary portion of the hard palate, we'll see the palatine bones. We'll come to those later. As the maxilla curves across the top of the mouth, we have the palatine process. The 2 palatine processes meet at the intermaxillary suture. Just behind the incisors, we'll see the incisive foramen. The palate allows us to chew food while keeping it separate from the nasal breathing. A cleft palate is when this intermaxillary suture doesn't form properly. And if this intermaxillary suture isn't forming properly, then we'll probably end up with a cleft lip also. We can see in the maxillary bones, there's a large maxillary sinus. Here's the locations of the maxillary sinuses on either side of the nose. It fills the maxillary bone. It has a much larger volume than the frontal, sphenoid, and ethmoid sinuses. You can see each of those sinuses here in this sagittal section of the skull. The palatine bones are L-shaped bones. They form the posterior portion of the hard palate, as we saw here. They also form part of the lateral nasal cavity. You can see the palatine bone here. You'll notice also in the palatine bone these greater palatine foramina. Next, let's look at the zygomatic bones. The zygomatic bones are pictured in light blue here. We're going to see in the zygomatic bone the zygomaticofacial foramen. The zygomatic bone also forms part of the zygomatic arch, the other portions formed by part of the temporal bone. So we call this the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. And then this purple portion of the zygomatic arch is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, because they're each reaching towards each other. Next, lacrimal bones. The lacrimal bones are pictured here in red. They form part of the medial wall of each orbit. They're definitely the smallest bone of the whole skull. In it, we'll see the lacrimal fossa. The lacrimal fossa houses the lacrimal sac, and the lacrimal sacs are involved in collection of tears. So this is the route by which tears, when you cry, make it into your nose and give you a runny nose. Next, let's look at the nasal bones. The nasal bones are shown here in this pinkish purple color. They form the bridge of the nose and support the cartilages that shape the lower portion of the nose. It's these bones that get broken when someone has a blow to the nose. Inside the nose, we'll see three conchae. The superior and middle are part of the ethmoid bone. You can see those here. The inferior nasal conchae, however, is a separate bone. It's the largest of the three conchae. And these conchae create increased surface area through little spirals. The vomer is in the inferior half of the nasal septum, pictured in yellow here. Remember, the superior portion was formed by the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. The vomer is going to support the cartilage that forms the anterior portion of the nasal septum on the inferior border. Finally, let's look at the mandible. The mandible is the strongest bone in the skull. It's the only bone of the skull that moves noticeably. It's our lower jaw. It supports our lower teeth and provides attachments for muscles of facial expression as well as mastication. The mental symphysis is where the two portions of the mandible come together in the front. It's a cartilaginous joint in the fetus, but becomes ossified in early childhood. The mental protuberance is the point of the chin. There are two major portions on each side. We have the body right here and the ramus here. The angle is where the body and the ramus meet. The alveolar processes, again, just as we saw in the maxilla, project up in between each teeth. The mental foramen is a small hole. The inner surface of the body is marked by shallow depressions and ridges that accommodate the muscles and the salivary glands. In the region of the mental protuberance on the inner surface, there's a pair of small points that are called the mental spines. You can't see them in this view. Some other features that we need to know on the mandible are the mandibular condyles. These are the oval knobs that articulate with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone and form the hinge of the temporomandibular joint. We'll also see the coronoid process. The coronoid process is a large surface area for insertion of the temporalis muscle, which again helps us close our mouth. Between the two is the mandibular notch. And on the inner surface of the ramus here, we'll see the mandibular foramen. Remember that anytime we have a large flat surface or fossa, it's a really good site for muscle attachment, so probably a big one attaches there. So there are a few other bones that are associated with the skull, but not attached to it. First of all, the auditory ossicles. The auditory ossicles are three tiny little bones that are inside the middle ear cavity. They're named the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, or the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, translated. Also, the hyoid bone. It's a slender U-shaped bone that's located between the chin and the larynx, or the voice box. It doesn't articulate with any other bones. So if we removed all the musculature, the hyoid bone would simply fall off. On our skeleton, Hank, it's screwed on to one of his vertebrae. The hyoid bone is suspended from the styloid process of the skull. You can see that up here. The hyoid bone has a body, a greater horn, and a lesser horn right here. If someone has a broken hyoid bone, it's a great indicator that they've probably been strangled. It's a hard bone to break. So during infancy, the bones of the cranium have spaces between them as they're growing. These spaces are called fontanelles. They're filled with fibrous membranous sheets, and they allow the bones to shift during child's birth. Sometimes you might experience a child's head coming out kind of crooked. It's because these fontanelles are not fused yet. There's an anterior, posterior, sphenoid, and mastoid fontanelle. You can see them labeled here in this figure. The two frontal bones are going to be fused by the age of 6, so we only ever really see one. And the skull is going to reach adult size by the age of 8 or 9 years. And so all these sutures will begin to fuse together. At that point, all the fontanelles will have disappeared and the sutures will be truly in place. So now we've finished our section on the facial bones. It's time to go back to Anatomy and Physiology Revealed. Be sure to put together an outline before you go of all the structures that we've covered in this lecture. Also, be sure that when you're in lab next, you get your hands on Hank and spend some time figuring out where all these features are in a three-dimensional structure. The way you'll be tested on this material is through the skeleton tour. That's where I'll pick a region of the skeleton and a region of the skull for you to give a tour, and you'll tell me everything you know about that region. So be sure that you get this stuff straight. All it takes is practice. And remember, you have your whole own skeleton, so you can practice this all day long.